All right, you sick fucks, buckle up. Because today we're driving headfirst into some seriously fucked up military history.
Oh, I love when history gets dark and twisty.
The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew.
It's like peeking under the rug and finding all the dirt they tried to sweep away.
We're talking about the Tonkinese Rifles.
The what now?
Basically, a bunch of Vietnamese dudes the French tricked into fighting their dirty wars back in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
The French. Seriously. Those cheese-eating surrender monkeys had a whole damn empire.
Oh yeah, they were all over the damn place, especially in Southeast Asia.
Huh.
And let me tell you, they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty to keep that colonial machine running.
So how the hell did they pull this off?
Exploitation was practically their middle name.
I mean, did they just waltz in and tell the Vietnamese to fight for them?
Well, before they went full-blown asshole with the Tonkinese Rifles, they were already dipping their toes in the exploitative waters, right?
Oh.
They had these Vietnamese auxiliaries in Cochin China. Think of it like the minor leagues for colonial soldiers.
Ah.
And get this, they even tried messing around with the Black Flags.
Black Flag sounds like a pirate crew.
Hold on to your hats because the Black Flags were hardcore rebels fighting against both the French and the Vietnamese government.
Double trouble.
They were basically these fierce guerrilla fighters, masters of the jungle, and they gave the French a serious run for their money.
Damn.
Problem was, they were a bit too independent for those baguette-loving control freaks.
So they were good at fighting, but didn't want to take orders.
Prone to undisciplined behavior, as those fancy French reports put it.
A Cohenora not taking shit from their supposed superiors.
Mingo. So General Millot, the French commander at the time, probably had one too many glasses of wine, decides he needs a more obedient force.
Makes sense, I guess. If you want to control people, you need them to follow orders.
And bam, the Tonkinese Rifles are born.
Ah, the birth of a colonial Frankenstein's monster. I see where this is going.
You gotta... Millot basically said, hey, let's take these Vietnamese guys, give them some shitty guns and uniforms, and make them fight our battles for us.
Classic divide and conquer bullshit.
And just like that, the Tonkinese Rifles were organized into battalions and regiments, all neatly controlled by, you guessed it, French officers.
Turn the natives against each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to add insult to injury, they even tried to recruit Black Flag deserters into the Tonkinese Rifles.
It's practically a colonial starter pack.
Talk about twisting the knife right.
Wait, really? They tried to recruit the guys they just called undisciplined.
From the French perspective, I guess it made sense use the guys who already know how to fight, even if they hate your guts.
It's a special kind of messed up.
So the Sino-French War kicks off in 1884, and guess who's on the front lines?
The Tonkinese Rifles.
The Tonkinese Rifles. They were thrown into the meat grinder at battles like Uoc Buck Lenk and the siege of Tuyen Quang.
So they're fighting for the French against the Chinese.
Basically cannon fodder alongside their French allies.
And how did they fare? Were they effective, or were they just used as sacrificial pawns?
Well, some reports say certain units fought bravely and even earned praise from French officers.
Oh, really?
But let's be real, they were often poorly equipped, undertrained, and led by officers who probably didn't even know their names.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag, a lot of needless deaths for sure.
Sounds like a classic recipe for colonial disaster.
But here's the real kicker. The war ends, France wins, and everyone expects the Tonkinese Rifles to get a break.
Use the expendable natives, worry about the details later.
But nope. The exploitation continues.
Seriously, what did they make them do?
They're sent all over to quell uprisings, fight pirates, basically do all the dirty work the French don't want to handle themselves.
So even after proving their loyalty in a war, they were still treated like second-class soldiers.
You got it. It's almost like the French were saying, thanks for the sacrifice, now back to cleaning up our mess.
It's mind-blowing how empires get away with this shit.
Right. And to make things even more messed up, they ship these guys off to fight in World War I.
Just pure exploitation over and over again.
In Europe, talk about being far from home and fighting for a cause that had absolutely nothing to do with them.
What the fuck?
I mean, imagine the culture shock, let alone the trauma of being thrown into a completely different war on the other side of the world.
It's a prime example of the dehumanizing nature of colonialism.
You're telling me. But surprise, surprise, the Tonkinese Rifles weren't happy with being treated like cannon fodder.
Just pawns in a global game of power.
And in 1930, shit hit the fan, they mutinied.
About damn time. What finally pushed them over the edge? What was the final straw?
It's tough to say for sure, but remember they'd been fighting French wars for decades at this point. The Sino-French War, WWI, putting down rebellions all over Indochina.
Right.
You can imagine the resentment was building. They were tired, pissed off, and probably realizing they were fighting for the wrong side.
Decades of being treated like disposable tools will do that to you. So how did the French respond to this act of rebellion?
They crushed it, of course. It was a short-lived affair, and the French made damn sure it wouldn't happen again.
Brutal, but predictable.
They weren't about to let a little mutiny jeopardize their control over Indochina.
Empires don't like to be reminded that they're built on exploitation and violence.
Exactly. But even the mighty French couldn't hold on to their colonial empire forever.
Yeah, empires crumble eventually.
The Tonkinese Rifles were finally disbanded after the Japanese took over Indochina during World War II.
Ironic, isn't it? After decades of being exploited by the French, they were ultimately disbanded because of another imperial power's invasion.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's like a cosmic joke.
Yeah.
But hold on, their story doesn't end there.
Hmm.
Remember, those decades of service created this battle-hardened Vietnamese force.
It really is.
Some of those guys went on to fight the French again, this time for Vietnamese independence.
But that, my friend, is a story for another deep dive.
Oh man, that's a whole other can of worms we need to pry open. Definitely a story for another time. But before we get there, let's dive into what these Tonkinese rifles actually wore. You mentioned shitty uniforms earlier. I'm morbidly curious.
Oh yeah, the fashion show of colonial oppression. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these guys were outfitted, or should I say under-outfitted.
From what I've gathered, their uniforms went through some interesting changes over the years. Initially, they sported gear heavily influenced by traditional Vietnamese clothing. Think loose-fitting tunics, colorful sashes, and a flat, varnished bamboo hat called a salako. Practical for the jungle heat, but probably not the best protection against bullets.
Sounds more like a rice farmer's outfit than a soldier's. Were they effective in combat with those get-ups?
Well, effective is a relative term, right? They were certainly distinctive, and remember, they were fighting in a tropical environment, so loose-fitting clothing made sense. Those stuffy European uniforms would have been a recipe for heat stroke.
Yeah, can't be charging through the jungle in those tight-ass European uniforms, bamboo hats and all. What about the actual combat gear? What kind of weapons did they have?
Initially, they were armed with a mix of outdated French rifles and whatever they could scavenge from the battlefield. Basically, the leftovers.
Seriously, they were fighting for the French, but couldn't even go decent weapons. Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's the sad reality of colonial armies.
Yeah.
They were considered expendable and often given the scraps. Remember, the French didn't want to arm them too well, just in case they decided to turn those guns against their benevolent colonizers.
Classic colonial paranoia. Let's arm them just enough to fight our enemies, but not enough to fight us.
Exactly. It's a balancing act of exploitation and fear.
But seriously, how effective could they be with such shitty equipment?
Well, their performance was often hampered by their inferior weaponry. It's like sending someone into a boxing match with one hand tied behind their back.
Except the stakes are life and death, not some sporting event.
Exactly. As time went on, they did get equipped with more modern rifles, though still not on par with their French counterparts.
So they got some upgrades, but still treated like second-class soldiers. It's a constant theme, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. But let's get back to the fashion show. I mentioned the salako hat, right? Well, that eventually got replaced with a conical version with a spiked top around 1912.
A spiked hat. Were they going for a more intimidating look? Or was it just a French fashion faux pas?
Perhaps a bit of both. It definitely gave them a more distinct silhouette, something out of a weird colonial fever dream. But then, in 1931, the pith helmet became the standard headgear for all Tonkinese rifle units.
Ah, the classic colonial helmet. Makes sense, I guess, from a practical standpoint.
Right. It offered better protection from the sun and rain.
But I bet it was still bloody hot and uncomfortable.
You can bet on that. But the shift to the pith helmet also marked a symbolic change. It represented the gradual assimilation of the Tonkinese rifles into the French colonial army, stripping away their visual distinctiveness.
So they were being homogenized, stripped of their cultural identity, turned into generic colonial soldiers. Another brick in the wall of empire.
Precisely. By the 1930s, the Tonkinese Rifles uniforms were practically indistinguishable from those of the regular French colonial infantry. Same khaki drill, same pith helmets, same equipment.
So they went from colorful sashes and bamboo hats to standard issue colonial khaki, a visual representation of their forced assimilation.
That's a sharp observation. The evolution of their uniforms reflects the broader story of the Tonkinese Rifles. Their initial recruitment with a nod to their cultural identity, followed by their gradual absorption and homogenization into the French colonial machine. It's a story of cultural erasure, all dressed up in khaki.
It's fucked up, but it makes you think about the psychological impact of that forced assimilation. Did it create a sense of loyalty to France, or just resentment and a desire to break free?
It's a complex question. I'm sure it varied from individual to individual. Some might have found a sense of purpose in their service, while others seethed with resentment. But the fact that they mutinied in 1930 suggests that resentment was simmering beneath the surface.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's
You can only push people so far before they snap back. And speaking of snapping back, that brings us to the Yanbai Mutiny, the time the Tonkinese Rifles said, enough with this bullshit.
Let's dive into that powder keg, shall we? It's a story of rebellion, desperation, and the limits of colonial control.
Exactly. The Yanbai Mutiny is where the cracks in the French facade start to show of you. So grab your helmets, kids, because things are about to get explosive.
So we've got this backdrop of simmering resentment.
Right.
The French are trying to control Indochina like it's their personal playground, but they're facing pushback from various groups who aren't too keen on being part of someone else's empire.
And instead of, trying to win over the locals or addressing their grievances, they decide to double down on the military force.
Typical.
Of course, that's the go-to move for any empire-facing resistance.
Crush the dissent before it spreads like a goddamn virus. And who better to do their dirty work than the Tonkinese Rifles?
They were basically the French Empire's cleanup crew, dealing with all the messy aftermath of their colonial ambitions. Uprisings, rebellions, banditry. The Tonkinese Rifles were sent to handle it all.
And let's not forget about the pirates.
Oh yeah, the pirates.
Indochina had a long history of piracy, and the French saw it as a threat to their trade and control over the region. They couldn't stand anyone messing with their precious profits.
Pirates? Starts to sound like an adventure movie. So were the Tonkinese Rifles fighting off swashbuckling pirates on the high seas. Were there parrots and eye patches involved?
Not quite the Hollywood version. Think more like river pirates operating in the Mekong Delta and along the coast. They were a real problem for the French, disrupting trade and raiding villages. They were like the mosquitoes of the sea, annoying and persistent.
Damn, so they were fighting actual pirates. Talk about a wild job description. Must be willing to fight pirates, quell rebellions, and clean up French shit. Low pay, high risk of death. Apply within.
It was dangerous work, no doubt. The Tonkinese Rifles had to patrol remote areas, engage in skirmishes, and try to capture or eliminate these pirate gangs. It was basically a colonial version of whack-a-mole.
So not exactly a walk in the park. These guys were thrown into the deep end of colonial warfare.
Exactly. The French didn't give a damn about their well-being. They were just tools to be used and discarded.
Speaking of being used and discarded, we talked about those punitive expeditions earlier. What exactly went down during those lessons the French were so fond of teaching?
Well, imagine this. A village is suspected of harboring rebels or just pissing off the French in some way. Suddenly, French troops and their Tonkinese rifle enforcers descend upon the village. They burn homes, destroy crops, and terrorize the population. It was a brutal and dehumanizing tactic designed to instill fear and obedience.
Fucking hell. So these guys were forced to be complicit in some seriously messed up shit. How did they reconcile that with their own conscience?
It's a question that haunts this entire story. Some might have justified it as maintaining order or protecting their own people, even under French rule. Others might have simply been following orders, terrified of the consequences of disobedience.
Yeah, being stuck between a rock and a hard place like that has got to fuck with your head. You're either a traitor to your people or a tool of your oppressors. There's no winning.
Exactly. We can't underestimate the psychological toll this took on the Tonkinese Rifles. They were trapped in a system designed to exploit them both physically and emotionally.
Let's rewind a bit back to that mutiny in 1930 at Yanbai. That wasn't just some random outburst, right? It was a culmination of decades of built-up anger and resentment.
Absolutely. The Yanbai Mutiny was a watershed moment. It shattered the illusion of the Tonkinese Rifles' loyalty and exposed the fragility of French control.
So let's break down what happened at Yanbai. What were the specific triggers that led to this explosion of anger?
Well, you've got to remember the context. These men had been fighting French wars for decades. They had witnessed firsthand the brutality of colonialism and the hypocrisy of French claims of civilizing Indochina.
They were basically living the lie of the French Empire fighting for liberty while being treated like slaves.
Exactly. And then there were the rumors that the French were planning to send the Tonkinese Rifles to fight in yet another war, this time in China.
Oh, hell no. After everything they'd been through, the French thought they could just send them off to another meat grinder. They must have been delusional.
It was a reckless move, but the French were facing growing unrest in China, and they needed all the warm bodies they could get. Vietnamese lives were cheap and expendable in their eyes.
So the Tonkinese Rifles were basically seen as disposable cannon fodder to be sent wherever the French Empire needed them. They were pawns in a game they didn't even understand.
That's the brutal reality of colonial exploitation. Human lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. It's sickening.
So the rumor of being sent to China was one trigger. What else pushed them over the edge? Was there a specific incident, or was it just a slow burn of resentment?
It was a combination of factors. You had the long-term grievances, the poor treatment, the lack of respect, the feeling of being used. Then you had the immediate threat of being sent to die in another pointless war. And on top of all that, you had the rising tide of Vietnamese nationalism.
Nationalism. So they were starting to think of themselves as Vietnamese first and French soldiers second.
Exactly. Ideas about self-determination and independence were spreading throughout Indochina. People were starting to realize that they didn't have to live under the thumb of a foreign power.
Makes sense? You can only push people so far before they snap back. And speaking of snapping back, that brings us to the Yen Bai Mutiny, the time the Tonkinese Rifles said, enough with this bullshit.
Let's dive into that powder keg, shall we? It's a story of rebellion, desperation, and the limits of colonial control.
Yes, exactly. The Yen Bai Mutiny is where the cracks in the French facade start to show. So grab your helmets, kids, because things are about to get explosive. All right, let's get back to our deep dive into the Tonkinese Rifles. We've covered their formation, their exploitation, that wild mutiny, and finally their disbandment as the French grip on Indochina started to slip.
It's a hell of a story. But before we completely wrap up, I'm curious about something. We've talked about the French perspective, the Vietnamese perspective.
Right.
But what about the guys on the ground? What was life actually like for a Tonkinese rifle? What were their day-to-day experiences?
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What was it like to be one of these colonial soldiers?
Well, for starters, life was tough. Remember what we said earlier? Crappy equipment, second-rate treatment compared to French soldiers. Their training was basic, focused on obedience and following orders, not exactly turning them into elite warriors.
It's not exactly a prestigious gig. You weren't signing up for glory and a cushy retirement.
Not even close. Pay was meager, and while food and lodging were provided, they were basic at best. Disease was rampant, hygiene, poor...
Right. Imagine the jungle heat, the lack of proper sanitation. It wasn't exactly Club Med out there.
Sounds more like a recipe for dysentery than a military career.
Exactly. And the dangers went beyond just battlefield casualties, disease accidents, even wild animal encounters. It was a constant struggle for survival.
So, what motivated these guys to serve? Was it purely out of fear of the French, or were there other reasons?
It's complicated. Some were likely pressured into joining, especially in the early days.
Right.
Villages forced to supply recruits, that kind of thing. But others might have seen it as a steady job, however lousy, in a time of upheaval.
That makes sense. When your options are limited, even a shitty job with the colonial army might look appealing. At least it's a steady paycheck, even if it comes with a high risk of death.
Right, and let's not forget that for some, it might have actually been a way to improve their lot, however marginally. They were learning new skills, handling firearms, getting a taste of a world beyond their village.
So for a few years, maybe it wasn't all bad. A chance to see the world, albeit through the lens of a rifle. A twisted kind of adventure tourism, I guess. Possibly. There are accounts of Tonkinese Rifles who were proud of their service, who saw it as a way to defend their homeland, even if it was under French command. Of course, it's impossible to know how widespread that sentiment was.
Yeah, and those feelings probably changed a lot after the Sino-French War, WWI, and especially after that mutiny. I mean, how could you see yourself as defending your homeland when you're being used as cannon fodder in someone else's war?
Absolutely. The Yen Bai Mutiny was a watershed moment. It showed that the Tonkinese Rifles weren't just passive tools of French colonialism. They had their own aspirations, their own sense of injustice.
It's like that saying, you can only push someone so far before they push back.
Exactly. And that pushback, that spirit of resistance, would eventually lead to the downfall of the French Empire in Indochina. It's a reminder that even the most powerful empires can be brought down by the people they exploit.
So after the mutiny, the Tonkinese Rifles were basically on borrowed time, right?
Yeah.
The French couldn't trust them, but they couldn't just get rid of them either. It was a precarious situation for everyone involved.
Absolutely. After Yen Bai, the Tonkinese Rifles were a shadow of their former selves. Their numbers dwindled, their roles were reduced, and they were constantly under suspicion. The French had created a monster, and now they were afraid of their own creation.
What a mess.
Yeah.
So what happened to them in the end? Did they just fade away, or did they play a role in the final push for Vietnamese independence?
When World War II broke out, the Tonkinese Rifles were still part of the French colonial army, believe it or not. They were deployed to various fronts, including the disastrous Battle of France in 1940.
Wait, so they were sent to fight for France in Europe again? After everything they'd been through, that's insane.
Yes, it's a testament to the enduring power of colonial exploitation. Even in the midst of a global war, the French were still using the Tonkinese Rifles for their own purposes. They were pawns until the very end.
Yeah. So what happened after World War II? Did the Tonkinese Rifles finally get their freedom, or did they just get traded from one master to another?
The end of World War II marked the beginning of the end for French Indochina. The Japanese occupation during the war had weakened French control, and the Vietnamese were more determined than ever to achieve independence. It was like a dam bursting after years of pressure building up.
So the stage was set for a showdown between the French and the Vietnamese, the First Indochina War. But where do the Tonkinese Rifles fit into all of this?
The Tonkinese Rifles caught in the middle of this conflict were essentially disbanded. Some joined the Viet Minh, the communist-led force fighting for Vietnamese independence. Others remained loyal to the French or simply tried to stay out of the fight. It was a time of chaos and uncertainty, and their loyalties were divided.
So after decades of serving the French, they were finally free to choose their own side. Some fought for their oppressors, some fought for their liberators, and some just tried to survive. It's a complex and tragic ending to their story.
Exactly. The Tonkinese Rifles, a product of French colonialism, became a symbol of the complex and often tragic legacy of empire. Their story is a reminder of the human cost of colonialism, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring struggle for freedom and self-determination. It's a story that shouldn't be forgotten.
Damn, that's heavy stuff. So to wrap things up, the Tonkinese Rifles is a product of French colonialism. Their story is a dark reminder of how empires operate. Exploitation, manipulation, sending people to fight and die for a cause that isn't theirs. It's a story that makes you question everything you think you know about history and power.
And yet, within that darkness, there's also a flicker of hope. The Tonkinese Rifle story also shows the strength of the human spirit, the willingness to resist oppression, and the ultimate triumph of the desire for freedom. It's a story that should inspire us to fight for a better world, a world where exploitation and colonialism are relics of the past.
It's a reminder that history is never black and white. It's full of shades of gray, and sometimes the heroes and villains aren't so easy to define. But one thing's for sure, the Tonkinese Rifles, they deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. Even if it's a story that makes us uncomfortable, it's a story that we need to hear.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe their story will inspire others to question the narratives they're given, to dig a little deeper, and to uncover the hidden truths behind those official versions of history. Because the truth, even when it's ugly, is always worth fighting for.
That's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive Question. Everything challenge the status quo and never stop learning. And that, my friends, is the bottom of the well for today. We've dug deep, we've gotten our hands dirty, and hopefully we've learned something along the way.
Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those uncomfortable questions. Because the truth is out there waiting to be uncovered.